First, we'd like to thank the consulate for the very filling lunch. And we're now going to proceed to welcome our panel, comprised of Diego, Jody, Grace, and Stephanie. And we will begin with Diego. Diego Javier Luis is the Rohrbaugh Family Assistant Professor in the Department of History at Johns Hopkins University. He specializes in Spanish, Pacific, and colonial Latin American history and is the author of the award-winning The First Asians in the Americas, a Trans-Pacific History, published in Harvard University Press. He also co-created the Historian's Table podcast and is the developer of Obraje, an educational board game that will be produced by Central Michigan University Press. So let's welcome Diego.
All right, thank you very much for the introduction. I'd like to also begin by thanking once again, the organizers of our symposium, Cristina Lee, Ricardo Padron, Hobi Sai, and the coordinator, Isabel Villanueva, and of course, all of the staff, and Leah, of course, and all the staff at the Newberry. I'm very grateful, as always, to be in your company today. I find these sessions when we're able to all get together and discuss the latest in the field of the early Philippines and the Spanish Pacific is so enriching and so refreshing as well to be among our interlocutors. So my talk today, I'm a historian of the movement of people. I like to think of myself as kind of sitting between social and cultural history. What I'm going to talk about today goes in a completely different direction. So I'll be looking forward to hearing your comments and questions about it. So this is unearthing early modern martial arts, military technology, and destreza in the Philippines. Like many missionary proto-ethnographies of its time, Historia de las Islas de Mindanao, Jolo y sus adyacentes supplies detailed commentary on the martial practices of indigenous peoples. And this is the text from the Newberry, that's held in the Newberry collection that I'll be focusing on for my presentation. It was written by the Jesuit Francisco Combes and published posthumously in 1667. Combes had been an eyewitness to Spanish evangelization efforts and military campaigns in Mindanao and wrote about military technologies and tactics, not as the distant observer, but as one well-practiced, I would argue, in the art of war. He departed the region when, in the face of a possible Chinese invasion by the famous Ming loyalist Zheng Chenggong, the Spanish fort at Zamboanga on the western tip of Mindanao was abandoned, a decision which Combes sharply opposed. While pressing for a renewal of Spanish evangelization in the region, Combes simultaneously acknowledged the acute limitations of Spanish arms in the face of indigenous war-making. Undoubtedly, Spanish colonialism in the Philippines, and especially in the predominantly Muslim South, was always precarious, and scholars of the Spanish Pacific, many of whom are in this room, have consistently identified the many factors shaping that reality: the decentralized nature of Spanish colonial rule, geopolitical threats, the heterogeneity of Philippine populations, distance from other colonies, and more. To this list, Combes' publication encourages us to consider that Spaniards also suffered from martial deficiencies in the quest to project power in the archipelago. Even as Combes sought to celebrate Spanish triumphs with his publication, he could not but comment on their severe limitations in the southern Philippines. His chapter 18, book 1, entitled Vessels and Arms of These Natives, narrates the military technologies and strategies that the peoples of Mindanao, Jolo, and Brunei used to thwart Spanish ingresses. For example, Combes writes that the Joloanos, quote, armed themselves from head to toe with helmets, armlets, mail coats, and rayskin greaves lined with elephant hide, arms so well tested that none can get the better of them except firearms, because the best swords and scimitars bend against them, end quote. In order to counter this armor, the Spanish maestre de campo, Pedro de Almonte Verástegui, deployed not Spanish swordsmen, but campilaneros from Ternate. Campilaneros were warriors who wielded the campilan, a sword that Combes described as an alfange, or scimitar. He said that these were, quote, made to cut off heads and to slice open bodies from head to toe, end quote, and that not even these had been effective against that armor. I find this brief notation and others like it extraordinary. The Spanish steel sword, so emblematic of European military prowess worldwide, had seemingly met its match in the Philippines against the armor of the Holoanos. Even the classic Seven Myths of the Spanish Conquest, in which Matthew Restall rightly questions the efficacy of early firearms, war dogs, horses, and other implements of Spanish warfare in the Americas, still concludes that, quote, the one weapon whose efficacy is indubitable was the steel sword, end quote. By virtue of its reach, deadly point, and durability, the sword seemed to have enabled Spanish expeditions to defeat indigenous armies and project power across vast spaces. These presumptions of asymmetric power imbalances enabled by military technologies like the sword remain influential in explaining the how of global Spanish imperial expansion from the 15th to the 19th centuries. As Restall himself has shown over the course of his career, such explanations are deeply reliant on the process of myth-making and petitioning for merit-based privileges present in the sources themselves. However, military technology that may seem decisive in one context were often not so in others. And in this regard, Combes' commentary was not so unusual. In Milicia y Descripción de las Indias, the Spanish captain Bernardo de Vargas Machuca lamented the limitations of Spanish military technology in Nueva Granada. On campaign, gunpowder got too wet to use, swords were too long to carry conveniently, and armor restricted mobility. He acknowledged that the Spanish shield, quote, is an inferior arm to the adversary's spear, end quote, the spear being a 30-span, fire-hardened weapon made of palm bark in that case. In fact, Vargas Machuca argues that if Spaniards were to find success on campaign, they would have to adapt to indigenous tactics and technologies and even use them. Indeed, Miguel Martinez, who we're fortunate to have with us today as well, shows that Vargas Machuca's comments were especially pertinent to Spanish campaigns against the Mapuche in Chile, where, quote, conquistadores adopted indigenous technologies and customs, and where the Araucanian were far more effective in their surprisingly expeditious and efficient appropriation of military practices, end quote. He demonstrates that consistent defeats in the face of organized armies and soldiers who used weapons with more destreza, or skill, or dexterity, it's also the word for fencing, than their counterparts, made empire appear a, quote, reversible process, that those who, being used to writing the epic of the victors, now had to construct for themselves an epic of the defeated, end quote. Even when we recognize that Spanish weapons did not carry the day, at least not in every case, the philosophies and techniques of their use had far-ranging repercussions from the Mediterranean to the Pacific. They deeply informed ideologies of conquest, evaluations of who was friend and who was foe, and proto-ethnographies of indigenous peoples, that of Combes included. Vargas Machuca's work is an early example of this phenomenon. In a manuscript from 1603 seeking to defend the legitimacy of Spanish wars in the Americas, the captain used a reference to a popular fencing manual to demonstrate his unabashed support of Francisco Pizarro's infamous attack on unarmed Inca nobles at Cajamarca in 1532. He proclaimed, quote, as Don Luis Pacheco de Narvaez writes in Verdadera Destreza Grandezas de la Espada, which is the book, the swordsman must consider 3 attacks to understand the foundations of arms. The first, an anticipated attack, the second, a simultaneous attack, and the third, a counterattack. For if he lacks this understanding, his skill will not be complete, and he will endanger himself in the battle against his opponent. And this is the key part. One should take this same advice in war and conquest, and they should be undertaken in the same manner. For if one should acquire and recognize the intention of the enemy, he should attack beforehand, end quote. Therefore, for Vargas Machuca, Pizarro had acted prudently. Having supposedly recognized the intention of people he considered to be his enemy, he had attacked before they were ready for war. Fencing theory had therefore become a discourse enabling massacre on an enormous scale. The sword as material object mattered as much as the ideas it communicated. And if there's any ambiguity about Bernardo de Vargas Machuca's the high place that he evaluated Spanish fencing ideas and his articulation of imperial expansion and tactics against indigenous people. This is the frontispiece to his Milicia y Descripción de las Indias, in which he writes a la espada y el compás, más y más y más y más. And el compás, of course, is the reference to the geometrical compass that he's holding in his hand that can not only measure geometrically the increase of Spanish imperial domains across the world, but compás is also the word for footwork in Spanish fencing as well. So the embodied movement of the sword, of using the sword, is explicitly connected to imperial expansion in this frontispiece. So Vargas Machuca's reference is especially provocative for the subject of this talk because the ideologies embedded in his reference to Grandezas de la Espada, published in 1600, found a new home in Combes's publication as well, which I'll describe in just a moment. Pacheco de Narvaez was the student of the inventor of Renaissance Spanish fencing, Jerónimo Sánchez de Carranza, who developed a method called La Verdadera Destreza, or True Skill, in his book entitled De la Filosofía de las Armas y de su Destreza, published in 1582. By the early 17th century, the followers of Carranza could be found throughout the Hispanic world, and Carranza himself served as governor of Honduras and died in Guatemala during the opening years of the 17th century. Pacheco de Narvaez, his text, turned Carranza's highly theoretical system into a style of swordplay that could be practiced, replicated, and communicated ostensibly in the absence of an instructor, which he sort of brags about on the frontispiece here, sin tener necesidad de maestro que le enseñe. So he also, and crucially, he also adapted the style to teach, quote, how one wielding a sword should defend oneself from a Turk and his alfange, end quote, especially because, quote, against the alfange, common weapon of the Turk, the usual tretas, or tricks, from vulgar destreza are useless, end quote. Only verdadera destreza had any hope of defeating the alfange, which in this case referred to the Turkish kilish, or scimitar. And again, the frontispiece here, what I really want to emphasize is the Grandezas de la Espada are at the gateway to the worlds beyond the Mediterranean, right? It's framed by the Pillars of Hercules, with plus ultra wrapped around the columns. So we've already seen how for Combes, the alfange of Mindanao and Ternate was the campilan, which he defined more narrowly as, quote, the single-edged alfange and heavier than the Turkish ones without a point, end quote. The Turkish alfange, weapon of the Spaniards' most serious geopolitical adversary in the Mediterranean world, was the operative point of comparison, facilitated in no small measure by the implicit conflation of Moros and Muslims more broadly in the Spanish imaginary. And what I want to emphasize here is when you look at these two types of swords, this is the alfange of the Turks, the kilish, and this is the campilan. And I wish I had seen the publication on display yesterday when preparing for this talk, which had extraordinary illustrations of campilanes from Davao. But looking at these two, it's, I think, objectively very strange that they should both be referred to as alfanges. Really, the only thing that they have in common is the fact that they are single-sided blades. Let's see, moving along. A highly summarized version of Pacheco de Narvaez's commentary on Turkish techniques with the alfange appears in Combes's writing about the campilan as well. Pacheco de Narvaez wrote that, unlike the wide variety of attacks that could be performed by a Spanish sword, quote, the alfange has only a single attack, atajo hendido, or descending cut, which consists of a single violent and natural motion, just raising your arm straight upwards and then lowering it with great power, end quote. This cut was thrown from an obtuse angle stance, meaning that the angle of the arm relative to the trunk of the body, as you can see in the example here, angle of the arm relative to the trunk of the body is obtuse, and in this case held overhead to encourage the Spaniard or the European to launch a thrust aimed at the body so that they could then, quote, chop the sword, and leaving the opponent thus unarmed, then kill or subdue him, end quote. In a similar vein, Combes wrote that the campilan, quote, only has two uses, which are hurling the alfange from one side and drawing it back from the other side to hurl it a second time in the opposite direction, end quote. This action is almost identical to how Pacheco de Narvaez described the uses of the Turkish alfange. It would follow then that the counters should be near identical as well. Pacheco de Narvaez outlines 4 techniques that all begin with what he calls an acometimiento de estocada, or a feinted thrust, which he represents here. And for the uninitiated, this can be a very difficult kind of schematic to get any meaning from whatsoever. But the important thing is he's showing the position of the feet, he's showing the relative positions of the sword, and the circle on the right side is the body of the opponent. So all of these techniques begin with the acometimiento de estocada to the chest from the ángulo recto, or right angle position, when the sword is held out completely horizontally from the body, in order to draw out the adversary's tajo hendido, or descending cuts, followed by a small movement of the wrist to free the sword, which today we would call a disengagement of the sword, which forces the tajo to miss the target. Then the Spanish fencer, and I realize this is getting a little technical, then the Spanish fencer advises stepping in a circular motion called a compás, which I mentioned before, to the left or to the right, and wounding with either a thrust or cut to the chest or face before the opponent can deliver a second cut. And he demonstrates how this action works in the text and also in the illustrations that immediately follow. So this is showing the circular movement of the feet and the finishing position of the sword after performing the techniques that I just described. And these are the different orientations. Okay, so, not there yet. So meanwhile, of the campilan, Combes remarks that, quote, it is a very bloody weapon, but for being so heavy, it is dangerous for the very one who wields it if he does not succeed in striking on the first attempt, its weight giving time for the opponent's points to enter, end quote. So though not nearly as detailed as Pacheco de Narvaez's recommendations for fighting against the alfange, it preserves the central components of his argument, that the alfange was used for descending cuts and that the way to defeat it was to take advantage of the time between the cuts by keeping the sword free to deliver an attack with the point. These instructions and comments further exemplify that the properties of the Spanish sword did not have any innate or structural or technological advantage over swords from other regions, but rather that swordplay was the arena in which stratagems directed against the enemies of Spanish Empire from the Mediterranean to the Philippines were articulated. All of these imagined enemies were similarly reduced to as Moros to their Muslim faith, and their use of similar kinds of weapons, namely the alfange as both Turkish scimitar and Mindanaoan and Ternate campilan. However, Combes was also clear that some weapons used in Mindanao and Jolo had no viable counter. First among these was the bagacay. In his words, the bagacayes, quote, are small rods with the thickness of a finger hardened by fire and sharpened at the ends. They throw them with such destreza, that word again, that they never miss whatever target they aim at, and some can launch 5 at a time. Though such a narrow weapon, it has such force that it has been known to pierce through a boat and impale and kill the rower, end quote. Combes was so amazed when he first heard about bagacayes from one Diego de Santiago that he ended up making one himself and threw it at a shield to test its lethality. Yet another example of a Spaniard experimenting with indigenous military technology. He marveled that such a small weapon, which, quote, would provoke laughter in Europe, end quote, could be so powerful and that it could even bring down a bull. He concluded that when Moro pirates close to throwing range, quote, they are certain to capture any ship because they send forth such a swift rain with these rods that hardly a man is left unwounded, and many, like bulls pierced with lances, can no longer move, bristling with so many arrows, end quote. Even at sea, where even skeptical historians acknowledge that Europeans had insurmountable military advantages, Combes gives the advantage to the wielder of bagacayes. Spears were similarly powerful, so much so that, quote, it passes through a steel shield and pins the soldier together with it, as has been seen many times. And in a skirmish that Captain Gaspar de Morales had in Jolo, even his steel shield could not save him. The lance passed through it and his arm, striking him with a mortal wound in the chest, end quote. Therefore, bagacayes and spears could do to Spanish steel armor what Spanish steel swords could not do to the elephant hide armor of Joloanos. Steel did not reign supreme on Philippine battlefields. Combes's account of Spanish campaigns in Jolo and Mindanao from his perch at Zamboanga allows us to call into question the role of military technology in Spanish wars of colonial conquest. These were not predetermined encounters between a civilization with superior arms and another hopelessly resisting to the bitter end. Rather, as Tonio Andrade has demonstrated in Lost Colony, which is a book about Zheng Chenggong's successful war against the Dutch in Taiwan, technology and strategy only mattered to the extent that they could be gainfully deployed in the contingency of war. They did not represent unconditional advantages or disadvantages, and they amounted to merely one of many factors informing the result of an encounter between two warring parties. When placed in the broader context of European wars in Asia, what Combes described in the case of Jolo and Mindanao was no exception. In 1603, Chinese peasants armed with no more than sharpened staves ambushed and killed the most experienced soldiers defending Manila, and Spanish eyewitnesses chronicled the techniques they used to do so. In 1661, Chinese soldiers clad in armor ran down and killed Dutch musketeers near Tainan, and in Taiwan. And according to Andrade, quote, the Dutch never managed to defeat Zheng forces in a field of battle, end quote. And lest I be accused of cherry-picking some of these examples, European sources are simply filled with anecdotes of close-run encounters, at least as many defeats as victories, and instances in which their supposedly superior weapons failed them. Moreover, as Almonte Verástegüi's deployment of Campilaneros, which I began with, suggests, structural comparisons between a European and an indigenous or Asian side, as was remarked in the previous panel as well, are misleading because, as numerous scholars have shown, the majority of soldiers fighting in Spanish colonial armies in Asia were themselves indigenous to the Philippines. Therefore, new models of martial conflict and the how of colonial expansion are needed, ones that do not presuppose that early modern innovations in military technology enabled Spaniards to effectively project power across half the world's circumference. More interesting, I would argue, is not searching for ever elusive structural causes of victory or defeat, but understanding how martial thinking, both as imperial ideology and proto-ethnography, informed the Spanish imaginary of geopolitical adversaries, the legitimacy of violence against them, and the mathematically and geometrically driven techniques that were to be used to defeat them. By the same token, when read against the grain, such sources also begin to communicate how indigenous peoples across the world, and especially in the Philippines, used weapons and developed strategies to combat Spanish incursion, the very, very real and explicit manifestation of resistance, martial methods that would later drive anti-colonial resistance in the 19th and 20th centuries, and that remain enormously significant as cultural markers linked to these legacies under the umbrella of Filipino martial arts today. Thank you.
Our next speaker is Jody. John D. Blanco researches and teaches colonial and post-colonial literatures and cultures of Philippines, Latin America, and the Pacific, with a focus on the early modern periods. He has taught at UC San Diego as a member of the literature faculty since 2001. He is the author of Frontier Constitutions, Christianity and Colonial Empire in the 19th Century Philippines, published with UC Press, and Counter-Hispanization in the Colonial Philippines, Literature, Law, Religion, and Native Custom, Amsterdam University Press. Let's welcome Jody.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you very much, Hobie, for that introduction. And I would also like to thank the organizers of the conference, Christina Lee, Miguel Martinez, Ricardo Padron, and as well as Hobie, of course. I would also like to thank Leah Markey for all of her help as the director of the Renaissance Center here at the Newberry. I actually saw your book in the bookstore. It looks really cool. I'm going to check it out later. And also to Izzy Villanueva for all of her help. Okay, so it's just my luck that I had to follow a paper about sword and swordplay. I'm going to be talking about monks. You know, I'll do the best I can, try to make it interesting. What is monastic sovereignty? With the publication of Marcelo del Pilar's essay, La Soberanía Monacal en Filipinas and La Frailocracia en Filipinas in 1888 and 1889, we have tended to regard the portrayal of friar influence in colonial society with suspicion, as a criticism that is somewhat sensationalist and overblown. How could monks and friars rule an entire archipelago? What army or supernatural force, what charisma would friars have to possess that their documented acts of abuse, corruption, and depravity throughout the Americas and the Philippines could somehow at the same time wield the force of law? This is a quote, an old Roman maxim, necessitas non habet legem, a necessity has no law, no laws. Here are some missionaries of the spiritual conquest. You saw this a little bit earlier. Historians like John Schumacher have characterized Pilar and Rizal's essays as examples of anti-friar literature, which carries the implication that their writings on some level amount to nothing more than the bickering of colonial reformists in the late 19th century, animated by racial antagonism and mistrust in the growth of a native clergy. My presentation today aims to correct this mistaken impression by tracing the concern over the impunity and license of the friar or religious orders, as well as the Jesuits, to the origins of the colony in the 16th century, with a particular emphasis on their confrontation with royal authority at the end of the 17th. In doing so, I invite readers to consider the implications of engaging in what one might call an anthropology of law in the Philippines, to describe the sources of friar and Jesuit authority and autonomy in the religious provinces. When I say religious provinces, I should add that these provinces comprise most of the archipelago outside Manila and 8 small villas designated suitable for Spanish settlement. These provinces constituted what we might today call mission territory. Oh, here's a we have no visual evidence of friar abuses in the Philippines in the 17th century, although we have a lot of descriptions of them by colonial officials. Here's an indigenous Peruvian author, Guaman Poma de Ayala, who offered some illustrations in the early 17th century of common friar abuses in Peru. You know, even though it's not the same thing, not the same region, you can get a general sense that the apple does not fall too far from the tree. As the Newberry document that I have chosen for my analysis shows, this authority and autonomy of the religious corporations owed itself to a foundational ambiguity in the Spanish crown's declared right to serve as the patron and leader of the church overseas, Patronato Real. This ambiguity not only freed the religious orders from any accountability to civil or canon laws, it also gave them unlimited license to exercise their will over native subjects to the degree that they were able. This license of impunity was grounded in legal immunity or privilege, which the religious orders had enjoyed under the rule of kings and emperors since the medieval period. The implications of its survival up to the 19th century, if not even today, anticipate not only the extraordinary forms of autocracy the orders were able to wield, but also the systematization of poverty in the Philippines with the growth of the plantation or friar hacienda. This is a larger claim that I treat at greater length elsewhere, but it's something to keep in mind as I move along in the analysis. So the document I have under consideration from the Newberry is entitled Defensa Canónica por las Sagradas Religiones sobre la visita que intentó y en parte ejecutó el Altísimo Señor Don Diego Camacho, Arzobispo de Manila, from 1698. And we heard a little bit about Archbishop Camacho in Marlon's presentation earlier. In English, the canonical defense by the holy religious orders against the visitation that His Highness and Archbishop of Manila, Señor Don Diego Camacho, attempted and in part committed. This defense was written by either a member of the religious orders or a letrado, a lawyer or advocate, working on their behalf, addressed to the king. It responds directly not only a manifesto written by Archbishop Camacho entitled, well, it's a long title, but I'll give you the the title, which is in English, "The Most Illustrious Señor Dr. Don Diego Camacho y Avila manifests to the Reverend Provincial Fathers of the Holy Dominican, Franciscan, Augustine, both regular and recollect, and Jesuit orders of these Philippine islands the reasons that pertain to them, in which the Archbishop can and must not only inspect and evaluate all the religious ministers of this archbishopric, as well as those who would come to exercise the ministry of pastorship in an official capacity, which is to say by officiating Mass and administering the sacraments, but also proceed to correct and in necessary cases excommunicate in conformity with the orders of the Holy Council." Fortunately for us, the title tells us most of what the argument of the document contains, so we don't have to waste too much time on that. Translated into plain English, the Archbishop here declares the authority and necessity of the Archbishop to exercise a procedure called visitation on the religious orders. As the title describes, visitation entails the inspection and evaluation of anyone and everyone pertaining in an official capacity to hold Mass and administer the holy sacraments: baptism, religious instruction, marriage, last rites. It also authorizes the Archbishop to inspect the records and accounts of a parish, from baptismal records to property deeds and donations to the parish, as well as interview members of the community about the behavior of the Padre Cura. Finally, visitation allows the Archbishop to take any and all measures to address any issues, problems, anomalies, or failings on the part of these ministers, which encompasses both members of the religious orders and ordained priests. In cases where a pastor or minister is derelict or delinquent in his pastorship, the Archbishop can go so far as to impose a fine or penalty on that minister, up to the point of excommunicating him from the church and stripping him of the authority to hold Mass and administer sacraments. You can think of visitation as a kind of internal inspection or even audit that the church exercises on its ministers. One final note to Archbishop Camacho's manifesto is that it was published and circulated under somewhat sensational circumstances that took place in 1698. When Camacho initially informed the mission parish of Tondo, which was administered by a member of the Augustinian order, that he planned to conduct a visitation, the Augustinians refused to let him do so and barred the church doors against his entrance. Camacho responded by ordering a bailiff to tear down the church doors with an axe. He then proceeded to request visitation. You don't have to take a picture of this. This is like an AI-generated image, just to give you a sense of what was going on there. He then proceeded to request a visitation of the mission parish of Binondo, which was administered by the Dominicans. The parish minister refused, and Camacho did the same thing. He then posted his manifesto on the broken doors of the churches, much in the same way that Luther supposedly posted his 95 Theses on the door of the Wittenberg Church in the 16th century. The Augustinians and Dominicans responded by recalling the ministers who tended to these parishes back to the convents in Manila, where they would be protected from answering to the Archbishop. They then published an official renunciation of these and all parishes under the care of these orders, which would prevent the Archbishop from accessing any information about any of them. Curiously, the Franciscans, Recollects, and Jesuits did the same almost immediately, even though their own parishes were not immediately targeted by the Archbishop's actions. Later investigation would reveal that all of the religious orders had earlier signed a kind of complot called a concordia, in which they agreed to this collective action should the Archbishop ever try to exercise authority over their parishes and convents. This is kind of something like a general strike that the religious orders would do whenever they were threatened by the ecclesiastical hierarchy of the church. The burning question that remains is, why did the religious orders believe themselves to be exempt from the Archbishop's authority, given that they themselves consider themselves to be members of the church, governed by an ecclesiastical hierarchy of archbishops and bishops, sometimes called the bishopric? The bishopric is responsible for all affairs pertaining to the established church, including primarily the examination, ordination, and administration of qualified individuals to serve as priests in parishes. These are called ordained or secular priests. The Defensa Canonica gives the answer to our question as follows. Members of the religious orders are exempt from the Archbishop's authority, as they have been since their very inception, because from the early medieval period, monks took a vow to remove themselves from civil life and withdraw into a convent, which made their accountability to the laws of a kingdom or community null and void. Instead of following laws, they are beholden only to their own religious superiors, who exercise the rule of their respective order over their members to the exclusion of any and all others, even the laws of the kingdom and the church. That's called immunitas, immunity, which is a privilege honored by Christian princes who recognize the spiritual benefits of the church and grant its agents their right to follow a spiritual rule which abrogates the applicability of any other law or rule. Despite the dispensation given to them by the Pope to act in the capacity of secular priests, however, they never relinquish their privilege of immunity as monks. They thus inhabit a world that is subject to civil or canon laws without themselves being subject to them because of the privilege of immunity. This immunity, the defense argues, has been upheld by popes and kings up to the end of the 17th century when this is happening. How does such an anomaly come about in which the agents, an interesting footnote here that, to say that they have immunity means to say that they're untouchable. And when Jose Rizal was giving the gloss, the meaning of the title of his novel, Noli Me Tangere, Do Not Touch Me, right? He had in mind what it meant to be untouchable in colonial society, which is a direct reference to the religious orders. How does such an anomaly come about in which the agents of the church and king are not subject to the laws of either? During the conquest of New Spain and Mexico under Cortés, but more notably in the ordinances of Spanish King Philip II in 1573, the Spanish crown recognized not only the benefit, but also the necessity of religious ministers as an instrument of Spanish rule. They would be sent throughout the Americas to complete the work of conquistadors without having to resort to undue violence. Yet the lack of ordained priests to accomplish this feat compelled then King Charles to send members of the religious orders, monks and Jesuits, to serve as priests until such a time that the church could establish itself with priests who had undergone the rigors of examination to serve as members of the official clergy. Yet by depending on monks and Jesuits to provisionally take on the role of ordained priests in spreading Christianity and administering its sacraments, Spanish monarchs opened a Pandora's box of ambiguities around the status of friars and the extent of their powers. Foremost among these ambiguities was the question of what authority they answered to. Were they subject to the canon laws of the ecclesiastical government or the bishopric, or did they continue to be exempt from such laws because of their commitment to the rule of their order? Were there limits to what the official church could ask friars to do? Would the archbishop's authority abrogate or be abrogated by the religious superior of a given order? In short, to what jurisdiction did these quasi-priest monks belong to? And what form of justice would correspond to this jurisdiction? Or could the religious orders themselves be subject to more than one jurisdiction? Finally, what process would ensure that the contingency of monk priests would eventually give way to an established church of secular priests under the ecclesiastical government or hierarchy of bishops? These are the questions that the Defensa Canonica seeks to answer in the form of a reputation of the archbishop's authority over them. And this is just a very clumsy sketch that gives you a sense of like how the division of power sort of works. You've got the Patronato Real that gives the crown charge of the church overseas, given to him by the Pope. But the religious orders are directly under the Pope, and their religious superiors of the various religious orders derive their authority from the Pope. The question here that's on the table is if the archbishop, as the representative of the crown under Patronato Real, can exercise jurisdiction and justice over the religious orders who claim that they do not have the authority to do that because they're in a separate jurisdiction. Okay, time constraints do not allow me to analyze the 9 rebuttals that the defense lays out, but I will simply draw your attention to 2 points highlighted here in black and red. Both, in effect, say the same thing. The religious orders lie outside the jurisdiction of both crown and official church, and thereby subject themselves only to their own justice, which is that of the religious superiors under the Pope and no other. This means, in effect, that neither the crown nor the church can evaluate the capacity of regular clergy as priests, nor can they inspect or correct any malfeasance or abuse that the regular clergy commit. Thanks. Neither can the crown or church validate or question the legal titles of land ownership that have been donated to the orders or any form of wealth they possess or come into the possession of. Most significantly, neither crown nor church can convert parishes administered by the regular clergy into parishes administered by the secular clergy, because these parishes are in a sense not parishes at all, but rather convents whose members of the regular clergy happen to hold Mass and administer the sacraments of baptism, marriage, last rites, and so forth. These convents and churches, the defense claims, were further built by the finances and personnel of the religious orders, not the crown, and therefore belong to the property of the orders exclusively. The pastoral tasks performed by the missionaries, finally, occur not out of duty to or by order of the king, but rather as a favor of charity, which by nature escapes the parameters of law or contract. To claim otherwise would be to expose the regular clergy to what the defense calls la relajación del estado religioso, or the threat of religious laxity before the vows of obedience and poverty. As the author of the defense puts it, and I'll just read the English thing just to save time. The regular clergy would be subject to two distinct authorities otherwise, neither of which is subordinated to the other, resulting in a government based on a monstrous law, as if one body had different heads like a monster, and thus the desiring and defense of the principle of immunity under the leaders of the orders comes from wanting to keep the established rule they profess, to love their subjection, and by consenting to visitation, they would be permitting regular subjects to violate their poverty and obedience. This quote gets to the heart of the dilemma. To acknowledge the sovereignty of the king, the friars would implicitly and explicitly defy their vows of obedience and poverty under their own religious superiors. In following two masters, they would spread legal anarchy. In place of anarchy, the Defensa Canonica implicitly proposes the maintenance of a diarchy, or coexistence of two powers under two separate forms of jurisdiction. On the one side, we have the official church hierarchy, or bishopric, under the crown by virtue of royal patronage. On the other, there lies the immunity and autonomy of the religious orders, who may act as religious ministers on the condition that they remain exempt from accountability under the religious diocese. This diarchy, however, begs the question of how the church would ever establish itself overseas, or if it remained forever unable to convert mission parishes in frontier lands into actual parishes, or how it would replace monks and Jesuits acting in the capacity of priests with actual ordained priests. If the condition of possibility of the mission overseas was the lack of ordained clergy from the beginning, how would the immunity of the religious orders ever allow a more populous ordained clergy to occupy the parishes now run by the missionaries? To what authority or law, finally, are native subjects in mission territories beholden? Our schedule today will prevent me from detailing and outline the several implications that derive from the doctrine of separate and divergent jurisdictions or friar immunity, but I will just mention three, well, maybe four. The first is that the allegation of monk sovereignty or overlordship, while not exact, highlights the root of what José Rizal called the social cancer, namely the condition of legal hypocrisy fomented and reinforced by the rule of impunity in the colonial world. By rescuing the monks from contradicting their own vows, the author of the Defensa Canonica imposes the monstrous government of self-contradiction back onto both the crown and the official church, not to mention the colonial subjects presumably under Spanish rule. Second, friar immunity facilitated the accumulation of wealth and lands that is at least partly responsible for the creation and reproduction of systemic poverty in the Philippines. So if we're going to congratulate the friars for introducing the plow to promote agriculture, we should also credit them for preserving and accelerating the excesses and abuses of the encomienda system under the friar hacienda. Third, the general incompetence and lack of oversight of the mission system gave Filipinos a degree of license to interpret and practice Christianity in their own languages, not because the friars taught Christianity in those languages, but because the official church could not compel the friars to teach Spanish. The Philippinization of Christianity, in other words, owes itself not to the wisdom and benevolence of the religious orders, but rather their stubborn defiance against the official church and king, who charged the religious ministers with teaching Spanish to the natives from the 17th century, as Marlon was showing us. On a larger level, one might argue that the orders were responsible not for the spread of Spanish rule, but rather its limitation to Manila and a few other small villas of settlement. Fourth and finally, and I'll end here, the Defensa Canonica corroborates a colonial legacy of immunity, impunity, privilege, and exception or expediency that is anchored in the survival and persistence of the religious orders. Necessitas non habet legem. Necessity has no laws. Rizal's indictment of these orders, these religious orders, as the primary agents and apologists of colonial violence under the guise of pacification, religious conversion, and Spanish patriotism is a message we have somehow succeeded in ignoring, despite or maybe through the required study of his novels and essays in Philippine secondary education today. The historian Renato Constantino once argued that we venerate national heroes like Rizal without understanding him. Is it because his message was too complex for us to grasp, or simply because we refuse to admit the central role that Christianity has played and continues to play in the survival of colonial institutions today? Thank you.
Our next speaker is Grace. Grace Liza Y. Concepcion is Assistant Professor of History at the University of the Philippines, Diliman. She holds a PhD in History from UP and an MA from the Universidad de Navarra, and undergraduate degrees from Witwatersrand and the University of Asia and the Pacific. Her research focuses on colonial Philippine history, particularly land tenure, indigenous agency, and Asian entanglements in the 17th and 18th century pueblos. Let us welcome Grace.
Thank you so much, Hobie. Good afternoon, everybody. First of all, I'd like to thank Christina, Hobie, and Leah, and everybody involved in organizing this and inviting me to share a bit about my research. So mine is very local, and for this afternoon, this is the title of my presentation. Okay, so in 1639, a Chinese laborer named Juan Imbin, working on the construction of a church in the village of Kaysasay, Taal, reportedly survived a miraculous near-death experience. He was supposedly executed in the massacre of the Chinese during the Chinese uprising. Christina Lee has discussed this extensively in her work, Saints of Resistance. This episode, later woven into local religious lore, offers a glimpse into the early presence of Chinese workers in Philippine pueblos outside Manila. Less dramatic and more mundane, though not less important, are the vouchers issued to the Chinese workers who were hired to complete the retablo of the Church of St. John in Liliu. Okay. In 1646. These are now compiled, these vouchers are now compiled in what is called the Paglayunan manuscript. Now, this paper investigates the extent and nature of Chinese presence in the province of Laguna during the 17th century, focusing on their roles as laborers, merchants, and landowners, drawing on archival sources such as the Paglayunan manuscript in the Newberry Library and the Composición de Tierras records from the Archivo General de Indias. The study contributes to broader discussions on Asian mobilities and entanglements in early modern Southeast Asia. In April 1646, the Principalia, or the native elite of Liliu, a town located approximately 100 kilometers southeast of Manila, issued a declaration concerning Juan Bautista, a baptized Chinese artisan. So the map shows where the region lies, and this is from the map, Murillo Velarde map of 1734, and this is a current, more a present-day map um, of the region. The regions highlighted are the ones that I'll be discussing. Well, not all of them, but anyway. Um, so anyway, Bautista, the Sangley, and other Sangley companions had been contracted to complete the church's altarpiece. These workers were to be recruited from the neighboring town of Siniloan. Um, so Liliu is the one highlighted in red. Well, it's Liliu and Mahayhay. And then Siniloan, Laguna is right there on the northeastern part of the province. So it's quite a distance. Um, so by February 1648, three Chinese painters, Siti, Lao, and Chaptico, I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing it right, had committed to finishing the altarpiece with their compensation documented through receipts issued by the parish priest Fray Juan Piña de San Antonio. These records are preserved in the Paglayunan manuscript housed in the Newberry collection. The manuscript comprises certified copies of deeds dated between 1601 and 1608, compiled in 1809. Linguist Jean-Paul Potet has studied the manuscript extensively, publishing his findings in 17th century events at Liliu in 2013. While the manuscript contains two seemingly unrelated cases, one concerning the Paglayunan family and the other the construction of the Liliu Church, it is the latter that offers valuable insights into Chinese labor and local interactions. The section titled Making of the Altarpiece, that's a section that Pote, well, he made a division of the manuscript because the folios just come as a continual, like they're just compiled without any sections or any headings. So the author that transcribed it and annotated it made those divisions. So the section titled Making of the Altarpiece 1646-1648 reveals the dynamics between the native Principalia, the Chinese laborers, and the parish priest. The declaration issued by Don Fernando Calunton and other town officials stated, well, this is in Tagalog, but I will read the English in the interest of time. Um, this I used my translation because I found some inaccuracies in the transcription and translation that was published in 2013. So here's my it's an awkward translation, but anyway. Here in the town of Liliu on the 27th of April, 1646, in front of the Father Custodian, Fray Juan Pina de San Antonio, and in front of the Capitan Don Ambrosio Pulong, and in front of the officials who have made this written document for the reason that this converted Sangley, whose name is Juan Bautista, and his companions, 5 in total, will be building the retablo and its columns, haligi, and they will follow whatever the father wished to be carried out. But 4 more workers are needed from Siniloan and will be paid an additional 100 pesos. Additionally, it was agreed that houses will be built for these workers' accommodation. This document not only confirms the presence of Chinese artisans in Liliu, but it also illustrates the economic negotiations and labor arrangements that shaped local religious and civic projects. So I'm guessing that since Siniluan is quite far from Liliu, even by, well, modern day standards, because the roads there are not, well, they're narrow and roads are winding, those temporary housing arrangements for workers could have turned out to be a more permanent arrangement. While this document does not give us evidence to this, the following discussion on landowners might make this more plausible. So, in this presentation, I asked to what extent were Chinese workers present outside Manila, and in what dimensions of local life did they participate? Chinese presence in the Philippines predates Spanish colonization, Traders from Fujian province engaged in commerce across the archipelago, and their numbers grew significantly with the opening of the Manila galleon, of Manila to the galleon trade. Many Chinese immigrants converted to Christianity and married local women, facilitating their integration into colonial society. Conversion granted privileges such as reduced taxes and greater mobility. Although the Spanish initially confined the Chinese to the Parian district in Manila, economic necessity led to a more flexible policy. Baptized Chinese farmers and craftsmen were permitted to settle in pueblos to promote agricultural development. This would have marked the beginning of a colonial community characterized by close interaction between native and Chinese residents. Following the 16, now regarding Chinese migration to Laguna, following the 1603 Chinese uprising and the subsequent massacre, many Chinese fled Manila. While Guagua, the town of Guagua in Pampanga, north of Manila, is a well-documented destination, Laguna likely attracted migrants due to its accessibility via the Pasig River and Laguna de Bay. By the 1640s, Chinese presence in the provinces like Laguna was significant enough to warrant inclusion in Governor Sebastián Hurtado de Corcuera's order to execute Chinese individuals not only in Manila but also in surrounding provinces. Despite such repression, Chinese commercial activity persisted. Licenses to operate businesses, particularly in the town of Pagsanhan, Laguna, attest to their continued presence. These licenses, often valid for multiple years, indicate permanent settlement and integration into local economies. One notable figure is Miguel Guangco, a Christian Chinese merchant who built Pagsanhan's brick church in 1690. He operated a variety store and employed assistants, some of whom were unbaptized. His guarantor, Juan Felipe Tianio of Manila's Parian, supported several Chinese merchants in Pagsanhan, revealing a network that linked provincial towns to the capital. A crucial source for understanding Chinese settlement in Laguna is the Composición de Tierras, a land survey conducted in 1697 following a royal order in 1692. The survey aimed to regularize land ownership and inspect holdings of religious orders and individuals. The Real Audiencia Judge Juan de Sierra Osorio conducted several interviews with the Principalia in various towns, including Laguna, to ascertain who among the residents held lands. These interviews revealed the presence of 36 baptized Chinese landowners in the province. So now I'll show you the tables that what I did was to list the people whom the native Principalia in Laguna listed as owning lands. And those who featured in the list were supposedly those who were considered as non-natives to the pueblo. So obviously the Chinese or the Sanglays would feature in this list. So here you have people from Pagsanhan. You have the name of the owner and then their ethnicity, obviously Sanglay, the type of land that they held, the number of years of occupancy. Sometimes that information was missing. At other times, sorry for the layout of the table, but here you could see that some held lands for 6 years, at least 6 years, others for just at least 5 months. And then you have here other details. Some of them held farmlands, others just house plots. But here on this table, apparently these people held farmlands where they sowed gantas de semilla, I'm not so sure, but they were seedlings for sowing. Yeah, okay. And then here, in this next table, okay, so the Pagsanhan Sangleyes continue, and then, yeah, so the type of, the same, you have the same sort of information, but here in this list, You have the Sangleas who owned just house plots. Okay, now the next, more Pagsanhan people. Pagsanhan had a river that was navigable and which was used as an access from Manila to the south of Luzon. So perhaps that's why many Chinese settled there. And then the next pueblos, the more Pagsanhan, yeah. Uh, Now, the next pueblos that listed Chinese settlers was Mahayhay. Now, Mahayhay in Laguna was more interior, and it was a higher place. And here, in this town, uh, you had natives who were quite averse to the Chinese presence and asked the government, the Real Audiencia, to please reallocate the lands occupied by the Sangleas to the natives, back to the natives. And then, after Mahayhay, you had Santa Cruz that documented only just two Sangleas. Sometimes, well, given their names, most of these Sangleas were Christians. And then finally, you had Liliu, the focus of the first part of the discussion, which documented only one Sangley who owned land, a solar donde tenía su casa, and who happened to be a baker. Okay. Now, okay, so in this set of slides, we find 26 Sangleyes or Chinese settlers who in Pagsanhan, 7 in Mahayhay, 2 in Santa Cruz, and 1 in San Pablo and Liliu. Okay, missing San Pablo. Okay, yeah. Anyway, some owned house plots, others held farmland. While the dimensions and productivity of these lands remain unclear, the labor required likely involved both Chinese and native workers. Occupation periods range from 8 months to over 10 years, indicating long-term settlement, well, suggesting long-term settlement. Miguel Guanco, who I previously mentioned, also owned a mill, according to the information gathered from the natives, suggesting his important role in the town as a miller, grocer, and employer. In Liliu and Santa Cruz, only one Chinese landowner was documented. The limited documentation does not necessarily imply absence, rather, it reflects the sort of visibility of these individuals to the native Principalia. And probably the other Chinese who were there did not really own land, so we don't really know much about them. Now, Chinese presence in Laguna eventually gave rise to the mestizo, the Sangles, offspring of Chinese men and native women. These individuals became increasingly visible in colonial society and were also documented in the Composición de Tierras. The survey listed 40 Chinese mestizo landowners, 15 in Pagsanhan, 8 in Santa Cruz, 9 in San Pablo, and 7 of them were women. So I'll just go very quickly through these tables. I did not categorize them according to gender, but I just followed the first format. But here you notice women already coming up as landowners. Okay, so Pagsanhan still was still predominant in with respect to Chinese presence. And then, yeah, more Pagsanhan people. I still have to sort out many details like the land tax. I don't know who they paid it to and why sometimes they had to pay the parish priest of another town for land tax. Maybe the church there owned the land, I don't know, and they were just tenants. And then in Santa Cruz, you have, this suggests a colonial mestizo community, Chinese mestizo community emerging. Santa Cruz was a vibrant town. It had a market, a regular market. It was also coastal, so probably that's why there was significant Chinese and Chinese mestizo activity. And then San Pablo also. San Pablo is the current capital of Manila. So you have more Chinese mestizo population. Yeah, more. And I think that's my last slide, and I'm concluding. So several patterns emerge. Number one is mobility and settlement. While Chinese landowners were concentrated in Pagsanhan, mestizos were more evenly distributed, particularly in Santa Cruz and San Pablo, towns that later became provincial capitals. Incidentally, I think in San Pablo is the current capital of Laguna, right? Yeah, I think so. Anyway, uh, is it Santa Cruz still? Okay, so Santa Cruz and then yeah. Okay. Their dual identity may have facilitated greater mobility and integration. Women landowners. Number two, second pattern is the presence of women landowners. The presence of Chinese mestiza women as landowners highlights gender dimensions of property ownership and economic agency. And a number which I can't detail now. Number three is economic interactions. Mestizos acquired land through direct purchase or by lending money and acquiring pawned properties, indicating active participation in local economies. So, in conclusion, this study offers a tentative but a tentative conclusion, but an account of Chinese, probably a compelling. I would like it to be compelling account of Chinese presence in Laguna during the 17th century. While Manila has traditionally been the focus of scholarship on Chinese migration and commerce, provincial towns like Liliu, Pagsanhan, Santa Cruz, and San Pablo reveal a more nuanced picture of integration, labor, and settlement. Chinese artisans, merchants, and landowners interacted with native populations in various dimensions of colonial life, from church construction to land ownership. Their presence laid the groundwork for the emergence of the Chinese mestizos, who would shape the social and economic character of the province in the centuries to come. Thank you very much.
Our next speaker is Stephanie. Stephanie Porras is professor of art history at Tulane University. Her research investigates the visual and material cultures of Northern Europe and the Spanish world from the 15th to the 17th centuries. Her latest monograph, The First Viral Images, Martin de Vos, Antwerp Print, and the Early Modern Globe, published by Pennsylvania State University, traces the complex production and reception histories of an illustrated book, a painting, and an engraving, all made in Antwerp in the late 16th century, but copied by Venetian print publishers, Spanish and Latin American painters, Mughal miniaturists, and by Filipino ivory carvers. So let's welcome Stephanie.
Thank you, and thank you again. I'm going to echo everyone's thanks to the organizers. It's been such a wonderful couple days. I'm going to pose for Ricky. Ricky's taking a picture of me. Sorry, I'm losing my voice, so bear with me. In the spring of 1593, the governor of the Philippines wrote to Philip II to inform him that he had granted a license for the printing of 2 versions of the Doctrina Christiana in Manila, in both Tagalog and in Chinese, to, quote, result in the conversion and instruction of the peoples of both nations. The Tagalog volume, preserved in a single copy in Washington, D.C., contains a single illustration, the title page, depicting St. Dominic in a landscape holding a lily and an open book. The technique used to produce this printed page, carving both illustration and text on a single block, had been out of fashion in Europe for several decades, but it was a typical technique for early modern East Asian books, as is the division of the block between an image at the top and text at the bottom, surrounded by a solid framing line. Yet the Doctrina's frontispiece also refers to European book printing via its inclusion of a thick decorative border of curving quasi-vegetal forms, a flattened ornamental scheme, evocative of the grotesque strapwork woodcut blocks inserted into similar missionary texts printed in the Viceroyalty of New Spain across the Pacific. While the history of printing in the early modern Philippines is scarcely new academic territory, with many important contributions made by people in this room, I would like to consider this well-known print alongside other illustrations from the very first Filipino imprints of the early 17th century as part of a larger art historical corpus consisting of works executed in multiple media and originating from different cultural contexts. That is, while Ricky Jose and others have done the important work of reconstructing the chronology and corpus of texts and images printed in the Philippines, what I would like to consider today is these early Filipino printed illustrations alongside a broader corpus of the imported European, American, and Asian prints and print technologies that we know from archival and visual sources were circulating in the early modern Philippines, as well as the shared material practices of carving and incision in ivory and wood and metal by Tagalog, Chinese, and Japanese residents of the archipelago. Given the short time allotted today, I'll focus on a few examples that suggest the ways in which this broader early modern Filipino print culture can be reassembled and understood as a transmedial and transcultural enterprise. Lucille Chia has suggested there was a community of Manon readers in Manila who may have participated in their very own distinct book market, citing the use of Manon dialect in both the Doctrina Cristiana and Letra in Lengua China by Kang Yong, printed by Kang Yong, as well as in Juan Cobo's Castilian translation of the Minjin Baijon, a popular text in Fujian. The earliest xylographic books printed in the Philippines clearly reproduce several key features of South Chinese book production. As I mentioned, the text and image are carved from the same single block used to print each page, largely following conventions, established conventions whereby the image occupies the top half of the page and the entire text and image block is surrounded by a black line. We see this format in Juan Cobo's 1593 Shilu, or the veritable record of the authentic tradition of the true faith in the infinite God, and its illustrations here, like the fable of the crab and the oyster. By the late 16th century, the book industry of southern China produced a wide range of illustrated texts, from compilations of popular dramas to pseudo-ethnographic accounts of foreign peoples to how-to manuals for artists. In 1590, Juan Cobo attempted to prevent a Christian convert and bookseller, Pablo Hechu, from returning to China. In 1606, only a few years after the expulsion and massacre of thousands of Chinese immigrants, there is also a reference to a Songle named Zunhu, described as a librero active in the Perian. Chinese printed books were very clearly available in Manila. Yet unusually, the earliest Filipino imprints are printed on both sides of each page, which is not how books were printed in China. In East Asia, the use of mulberry paper, which is thinner and more flexible than European rag paper, meant that books were usually printed on a single side and folded so that the printed side of each sheet faced outwards. And you can see that in the picture here, how you pull up a sheet. And these folded sheets were then bound with either a wrapped back or side stitching. Printing on both sides of such thin paper, as you can see in the Doctrina and the contemporary Shilu, made the text difficult to read. As Piet van der Loon has argued, Juan Cobo's Shilu was profoundly influenced by the Chinese catechism composed and printed in mainland China under the direction of the Italian Jesuit Michele Ruggiere's Tiansu Shilu, printed in 1584. Yet that text, printed in Xiaoqing, had adhered to the traditional one-sided format of Chinese printing and included no illustrations outside of the Jesuit monogram on the title page, unlike those earliest xylographic imprints of the Philippines printed on both sides and with images. In contrast, the image program of the Shilu includes not only the frontispiece, a pictorial interpretation of the text's dialogic format between a Dominican priest and his Chinese scholastic interlocutor, but also includes various diagrams, such as this one, derived from European Ptolemaic cosmology, showing the 10 heavens. This kind of image circulated throughout the Iberian world via printed editions and commentaries on the 13th century scholar Johannes de Sacrobosco's Tratado de la Sfera. And here I'm showing you a 1545 edition published in Seville, which contains several woodcuts that resemble those in the Shilu. text and image on each of the Shilu's 4 fold-out pages argue for the spherical shape of the Earth and present information regarding the science of navigation. But what I want to draw attention to here is that the approach to the image differs remarkably from other contemporary East Asian books, which never employ this fold-out kind of technology. So this book of medicine, for example, adheres to the traditional binding method, which bisects a similar circular diagram across 2 adjacent pages, so across the fold. So there's 2 subsequent folds. Or in this book on hydraulic engineering, which cleverly splits its illustration across facing bound pages. These deviations from East Asian illustration and binding strategies reveal the equal importance of European printed models for the printer and publisher of the Shilu, and also remind me of an anecdote relayed by Domingo de Salazar in his 1590 letter to Philip II, where he describes how a bookbinder from New Spain arrived in Manila looking to establish a business and employed a Songlay assistant. This assistant, surreptitiously observed the bookbinder and learned the trade in only a few months. He then undercut his former employer on price, forced him out of business, so that the poor bookbinder had to return to New Spain on the next galleon. Salazar writes subsequently that, quote, in translation here, "Everyone goes to the Songlay who does such good work. There is no need for the Spanish artisan. I have in my hands a Navarro bound in Latin, bound by him, which in my judgment could not be bound better in Seville." This anecdote, along with other printed and sculpted evidence, suggests there was an active market for printed materials in late 16th century Manila. A slightly later imprint, the 1607 Simbolo de la Fe in lengua y letra china, printed by Pedro de Vera in 1607, includes a diagram of the heavens indebted to the Shilu. This kind of recycling of printed imagery was common in both European and late Ming publishing cultures, both of which encouraged the kind of reprinting of illustrations and practices of compilation. The Simbolo's illustration of a fantastical sea creature is also directly lifted from 1583, Luis de Granada's Introducción del Simbolo de la Fe. The book also contains related cosmological and navigational imagery from the earlier Shilu, but also has new prints like this anatomical woodcut. But the pose of the figure evokes Thessalian anatomical illustrations that were also well known in the Spanish world. The frontispiece of the Simbolo de la Fe would itself be recycled by Thomas Pinpin in his Tagalog dictionary of 1610. So there's earlier discussion of the mobility of presses, the mobility of blocks, all these things being reused. The illustrations of the Simbolo de la Fe suggest there was a range of European printed images available in early colonial Manila. Antonio Garcia Abasolo surveyed inventories of goods owned by Spaniards who died in Manila, and when he died in 1607, Pedro de Zuniga had imported books from Mexico, missals, breviaries, prayer books, Cicero's letters, songbooks, and primers. There's also evidence of a variety of single-sheet prints circulating in the archipelago. Marjorie Trusted has identified printed sources for several surviving ivory plaquettes depicting this one here, St. Martin and the Beggar, as well as the Tota Pulcra. Elsewhere, I have traced a corpus of St. Michael statues carved in ivory that were also clearly modeled on Antwerp prints of the Archangel. The magnificently carved choir styles of San Agustin, made between 1608 and 1612, with their complex strapwork ornament, will also reveal, I think, the influence of European printed ornamental designs like those popularized by the Antwerp publishers Hieronymus Koch and Gerhard Joda. While European imported single-sheet prints do not survive in Manila collections, these kinds of related objects help us reconstruct the variety of printed objects, books, and single-sheet prints that must have been available around the turn of the 17th century in the archipelago. There are also archival references to single-sheet prints being made in Manila, such as the Carta Annua, the Jesuit annual letter of 1603, which mentions printed images being distributed. We know that on All Saints' Day in 1602, the Jesuit College of Manila distributed images of the saints. Ratana suggested that the woodcut on the frontispiece of this 1613 dictionary was, in fact, either made for an earlier book or possibly for one of these single sheet prints that's circulating. in Manila. As Ricky Jose has shown us, the earliest surviving estampitas printed in the Philippines appear in a copy of the 1623 Virgen San Mariano held at the University of Santo Tomas and the Archivo Francisco Ibero Oriental in Madrid. Many of the pasted-in prints are now missing, but he has meticulously reconstructed their potential order. These prints, unique amongst the illustrations that I've discussed thus far, are engravings rather than woodcuts. As such, their production required a distinct skill set of wielding a burin to engrave a copper plate, a skill heretofore unpracticed in the Philippines, to my knowledge. And he has suggested that the engraver may have been Tagalog, although acknowledging the fact that there was a Japanese printer, Miguel Sasio, who was working at the Augustinian press around 1618 to 1621. And I think the style of these engravings, which I haven't seen in person yet, I'm hoping to see this summer, are not dissimilar from the only surviving engraved image printed by the Jesuits in Japan, an image of the Virgen de la Antigua on the right, which is in Nagasaki. These engravings all share an ambitious approach to the figure, particularly in forms of drapery and these kind of use of short parallel hatching, although the Chinese example, I think, outstrips the estampitas in their kind of its complex use of patterning. But the Dominican press that published the Virgen San Mariano, that's a volume that's all produced in Romanized Japanese, and the close ties between Manila and the Japan missions means that their prints and artworks and artists must have been circulating and regularly traveling across the South China Sea, which might have produced this kind of relationship. To conclude, because I have a short amount of time, I know I'm the fourth paper in a long session, reconstructing the visual print cultures of early modern Manila requires an expanded geographic and material frame. What I've outlined here is only a very rough beginning, but I hope it indicates the potential of such an approach, connecting surviving printed images, carvings, and other artworks to potential printed models hailing from China, Japan, Europe, and the Americas. This is not just a project of recovery, of locating iconographic and technical sources for artworks made in the Philippines, but I hope can open the door to a more nuanced exploration of colonial Filipino print culture as simultaneously a local, regional, and global phenomenon, relying on prints produced in multiple centers using different print technologies and often drawing on immigrant labor, suggesting ways in which prints were not just tools of conversion and political control, but could also actively circumvent blockades and embargoes. Investigating Manila's print culture suggests the ways in which printmakers and printed objects negotiated both disparate and connected markets, allied and rivaled patrons and audiences to create new types of art objects in the archipelago. Thank you.
So thanks to all four speakers. I'd like to ask them to come up on stage so that we can begin an open forum. I have a question to start out with, and I was wondering, through the different papers, what the indigenous made of the situation, the legal anarchy that was coming in, the new forms of military technology that people had to deal with, the fact that there were Chinese migrants into indigenous towns. Was this unusual? Was this a new thing? And how did they react to this? And for Stephanie, I was wondering, the visual imagery in towns of Laguna, for instance, wherein we see also the indigenous work with Western forms. Would you know a little bit about that, and could you tell us how they were managing this sort of thing?
Thanks, Hovey, for the question. Yeah, I mean, it is. I think it's probably the subject of a longer conversation. How did people respond or react? But I think that the discussion over the course of the morning and yesterday also kind of gives you a hint of, again, that question of heterogeneous responses and engagements with the fragmentary nature of colonial rule. There were instances in which natives, or one could imagine natives taking advantage of the struggle and the competition, not only between religious orders, but also between the religious orders and the government. And in being able to side with one against the other on a given issue, they would be able to find different forms of their own agency. There were also, I mean, the one, of course, thing that we come back to with the religious orders and their use as an instrument of completing the conquest is that they themselves are not conquerors, which is to say that, they don't, although there were many members of the religious orders, Combes being one of them, but others who considered themselves also soldiers and did fight in various wars, the Moro Wars and the Dutch Wars. For the most part, the religious orders and most of the missions did not accompany a fortress or presidio in mission territory. Oftentimes they were pretty much out there on their own. And so, that's why there's the part in my paper where I mentioned that they had the power or the authority to exercise a certain license over their colonial subjects to the degree that they were able. But there are many stories in the colonial chronicles of natives making fun of priests or playing tricks on priests or deceiving them. This morning we talked about the custom that San Agustin was railing against, but which a number of other missionaries talk about the complicity of native groups to remain silent before the priest. Vicente Rafael wrote a book about how confession was this way of ferreting out the secrets of natives, but on a practical level, many communities just responded by telling their children, "Don't talk," don't and telling each other, "Don't talk." When the priest comes in, he asks you these questions and he gives you the interrogation. Don't let them in to the way that we do things. And so, that's why you'll find these kind of instances in the 17th century, in the 18th century, in the 19th century, where missionaries are bemoaning the progress of the mission. They say, how is it possible that after 1 century, 2 centuries, 3 centuries, they're still practicing these ways of venerating their ancestors that we had told them was the work of the devil from the 16th century? Here we are in the 19th century, and they're still doing these same practices. How is it possible that we missed this? How is it possible that we weren't able to control or guide or administer it? So there's a very partial kind of fragmentary aspect of native responses to colonial rule, because there was a very fragmentary and partial aspect to colonial rule. And I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, in a kind of similar vein, with Combes and the chapter that I focused on for this presentation, I mean, I think that I guess what I want to emphasize is that war making emerged as a kind of dialogue, right? And the kind of effectiveness of indigenous implements of war were not necessarily something that was like inherent in their materiality, but already an adaptation. And there are a number of other examples that I found in my previous research that I did for my book of, I looked at the Carta de Méritos y Servicios of a Philippine elite from Pampanga, a guy named Don Diego di Marocco, who, and his father, who led like a unit of harquebusiers during the 1603 rebellion, and were renowned for how they used firearms against the Chinese rebels. You have another example in the 1593 uprising against the father of Luis Perez das Marinas is Gomez Perez das Marinas, thank you. And how the rebels used Japanese katanas to slay the Spaniards on board the ship. And so you have throughout this region, I mean, this is part of this broader process of cultural transmission and adaptation that we've been talking about over the course of the past day and a half. But it extends to the arena of warfare as well. Yeah, I think in all of these sources you see really unique and also effective indigenous adaptations of both war technologies of war that already existed in the islands and new technologies that are arriving during the colonial period as well.
Okay, so Chinese presence in the towns was not new, I think, because you had the natives. Natives had commercial relations with the Chinese. The Chinese would visit different towns to sell their wares, but there were laws that prohibited them from staying in the pueblos. However, some of those laws became flexible, and eventually they were allowed to settle in the pueblos to improve agriculture. Reaction from the natives diverse also. Um, well, evidenced by intermarriage. The Chinese eventually married into local families and gave rise to the Chinese mestizos. But what really called my attention studying the accounts of the composiciones de tierras was how diverse native reaction was to the the idea of Chinese owning land. For instance, in Laguna, they most of them were unanimous in asking the Real Audiencia to reallocate lands held by the Chinese or the Chinese mestizos or not or those people who were not natives to their pueblos back to native ownership. Okay, whereas in Pampanga, um, the natives seem to be more open to the idea of Chinese and Chinese mestizos owning land. I still don't know why. Um, yeah, I still don't know why. Maybe because of the abundance of land in Pampanga. Well, Central Luzon is quite huge. Laguna in especially the southeastern part of Laguna was much smaller and maybe less fertile. So yeah, those are primary preliminary guesses, but I don't know. But anyway, diverse reactions from the natives. Some were open, others were not, and to them, Chinese presence was not unusual. Well, at least the sources um, suggest that.
I think with print, it's always collaborative, right? You always need many hands to produce the presses, to get access to paper, to print, to carve the blocks. We know by Thomas Pinpin, there's indigenous publishers who are in charge of coordinating that process. So I think even though the sources tend to, I think, privilege Songlay involvement or describe Songlay involvement, I think undoubtedly there were indigenous laborers and working on these projects. And then already by 1607, you have a Tagalog publisher, right? So I think it's kind of approaching these things obliquely. It's not quite as direct as the Spanish archival sources on the Songlay involvement in printmaking, and that we know that East Asian book culture is so dominant already in the region that South Chinese publishers are producing books for a wide range of international readers in the South China Sea, which it would have included, I think, Manila prior to Spanish conquest. There was already an export trade in books. So, yeah, no, I think it's reading kind of obliquely for indigenous presence, but I think it's undoubtedly there.
Yeah, be nice to have also wide references of indigenous forms to be able to detect them in these colonial texts. So, questions first from Manala.
I just wanted to say na I find it interesting that Miss Grace talked about the role of the Chinese in land ownership using the Palayunan document, but it's just funny that I read the same document, and what really got me so excited was the it talks about the production of retablos or altar screens, and it talks about the process. No, that well, first of all, that the Chinese are involved, the Chinese workers were involved. Number two, that it talks about the time frame in which retablos were made, and third, that it talks about the retablos were painted white, maybe maybe it was gesso, and then they were first to show it to the parish priest before they continued with it. But at the same time, it's also very challenging because of the idea that there is a supposedly a famous carving town or town of sculptures, Paete, which maybe did not maybe it wasn't a carving town yet at that time, but it's just interesting that it's there. I mean, there's a carving town in the same area, but they didn't get carvers from Paete, but got them from Sinaloa. And finally, there's a discussion about the making the retablo and its two columns, which I find puzzling because I mean, in that period, that retablos would have many niches with many columns. So I wonder whether it was just one. They were just talking about one niche with the column, no? So things like that. It just to show you that. Well, I guess we are art historians are the minority here, but but just interesting that you're talking about the same document and something else catches our fancy. Thank you.
Great. Would the art historians want to respond? Okay.
I mean, I wish I read Tagalog. I mean, I mean, that's the point. Is that document has been inaccessible, so I think there's not been Tagalog readers, art historians who've looked at that source. And I mean, this is what this gathering is all about. I think bringing together people, and I think that would be a wonderful collaborative project for. There's many graduate students in the room, for somebody to do. Looking markedly over there, because I think there's rich sources. There's amazing objects that I think haven't really been studied.
Can I just say something? Incidentally, sir, the
Microphone, Grace.
Sorry, yeah, the photo. This is biased for tall people. The photo I showed of the Liliu retablo. Well, I grabbed it from Facebook. Yeah, it's new. And it says there, okay, so the person uploaded it 2024, and then a commenter, an internet person on Facebook says, that's new, but um, reconstructed based on archival sources. Well, I don't know where he got that, of course. So, yeah, obviously it's not just two columns, but I'm not an art historian. But yeah, I agree that just one document can yield many different readings and can be approached from different angles. So yeah.
Jesus Escobar from Northwestern University. I want to say all four papers are wonderful in so many different ways. So I don't think I have a profound question, but I wanted to comment on the last two if I could. So Grace, I really like your recovery of just thinking about who built a monument. And Stephanie thinking too, taking the choir stalls as a starting point to understanding their making. And so I wonder if you could just, either of you talk about just the challenges or maybe the opportunities that come from that are part of your efforts in reconstructing the lost processes of labor. And it's really about labor that I'm getting at.
Yeah, well, it's not an easy question, but yeah, well, what I do, my method is really archival. So yeah, especially with this document, I just chanced upon the book, the 17th century events in Liliu, the one I showed you, and then looked at the folios. And actually, I read it several years ago, but not with approaching it from a local history point of view, because I was then doing my dissertation on Laguna, and I wanted to see the the voice of the indigenous. So I didn't even see the Chinese there. And I didn't see the Chinese definitely as laborers because I wanted to see the Principalia and the natives. But I think now approaching it from a more broader mindset and examining the same document um, with the perspective of looking at interactions among the different Pueblo residents, then I saw the aspect of labor. That yes, the Sanglees really collaborated with the indigenous in order to come up with these structures. In fact, the Liliu Church is not the only church that was built by the Chinese. Um, there were others, and we have the art historians here who can say that, and then who can explain and elaborate. Um, yeah, um, and then of course the composiciones de tierras. Uh, I also looked at those documents. I'm looking at them now to look at native land ownership. But then the Chinese keep on resurfacing, and then from the accounts of the composiciones, then we could also see how uh, they were involved in agriculture, not just as landowners but also as workers. Because natives would say, would give testimonies and say that, oh, the Chinese started occupying the land, and then um, they asked the Principalia if the land was occupied, and since it was not, we allowed them to farm there, and now we do the same. so so I think it's a lot of patience and yeah, and a lot of archival digging through the archives. Yeah, and that's the way I try to like reconstruct all these patterns. Yeah, thanks.
Great.
Oh, sorry. I think for me, I saw the Celeria in Manila, and I was like, this thing is amazing, and it's so beautiful. It's familiar, but it's also it's an elaboration, right, on the printed model in a way that's goes far beyond sort of Ferdinand de Vries's little compartment. Um, so I think in part I'm interested in the ways in which you have local carvers who are responding to printed models and recovering all the things that they might have had access to, but also that wood is indigenous wood. Um, it's a hardwood, and then it has harder woods inlaid in it, and sort of thinking about those materials. So it. This is, as I said, kind of like a groundwork project of identifying and thinking about all the printed materials a carver would have access to. And it would be also Chinese materials, maybe Japanese materials, indigenous knowledge about the woods, and thinking about all of that in play in the making of that object. And I think that's a very traditional art historical approach. I don't think it's anything revolutionary, but I think just giving attention and really thinking about those printed sources, just because they don't exist now doesn't mean they didn't exist. So I think that's really always motivated my work on print culture, because the San Miguel that I wrote a book about, there are no surviving impressions of that print in Latin America from the 16th century, but it undoubtedly was everywhere. So it's always about a recovery of that object, but then not trying to make it all about, oh, they must have had this print and that's it. That's the problem solved, because it's all of these other inputs to the creative process. And the ivory sculptures, I think, are the great example of a product that is a new invention, really, of the Philippines, that is export market, that they are creating. Those multi-part ivory sculptures don't exist until Filipino makers make them.
Dana Leibson, Smith College. Thank you all for the papers. I'm struck by something that Grace said in the Q&A already, and I wanted to pick up a thread there. You said that you were surprised by how many different indigenous responses there were to the presence of Chinese people in their communities. And what that made me think about is, well, what surprised each of you in your work? And so I'm wondering if you could just say a little bit about what you're finding that is surprising to you, or that you never saw coming, or that maybe you hoped you would find and you're not finding. Super polished presentations, even though you're saying it's work in progress. But I think it'd be interesting for us to hear a little bit about, oh, I didn't know about that. Or, now what do I do?
I have lots of these, so I can start. I don't know where the paper, if all the paper is mulberry paper or if it's imported paper. I don't know who made the presses. I don't know who. The switch from xylographic method to letterpress, why that becomes important at a certain moment. If you have the labor that can produce xylographic prints, that's also a valid way of producing printed books. It's like I can keep going. The combination method of using the symbole de la fe, where it's both xylographic and letterpress, is a very weird combination of things. So yeah, I think there's a lot of unanswered things that are surprising to me about why or how certain objects are printed. At a very early moment, we were talking earlier at the table about, there's a very well-documented case of the Jesuit printing press being sent from Lisbon, and it stops, and where it stops and gets printed. In the meantime, stuff's just being printed in Manila, and they worked out how to do it. So, how did they work out how to do it? Yeah, so I think I have lots of things that are surprising to me, and I think this is why I'm interested in thinking about what are the ways in which, say, the Ptolemaic system might be coming through Chinese prints that Ricci was involved in, not through Spanish books, right? Like whether what I expect the source to be is one thing, but it might actually be coming from a completely different direction.
I can jump in. Yeah, I mean, a lot of my previous work and work that I'm continuing to do revolves around questions of social mobility and also spirituality, and I've looked at previously cases of indigenous people from the Philippines in colonial Mexico, for example, petitioning for the right to be able to wear Spanish weapons, and oftentimes these petitions relied on demonstrating records of military service of various kinds. So I'm continuing to be interested in how use of weapons, and I mean, I think this in some ways gets back to the labor question, because one of the big unknowns, I think more broadly, even outside of the question of indigenous soldiers and Spanish armies, but is, what exactly did training consist of? What kind of knowledge gets imparted? And even, what kinds of weapons are indigenous soldiers using, and kind of long-standing training and traditions that go into that. So those are continuing questions that I have here. Obviously, for the purposes of this presentation, I'm working from one Spanish source. I'd like to broaden that out more and thinking about this conflict that he's documenting in the middle of the 17th century in Mindanao and Jolo. And also, I know that a lot of these weapons have ceremonial, ritual, and spiritual use as well. And that's something that Combes also comments on. And this is, in some ways, it's also true of Spanish weapons as well. There's a manuscript document in the Newberry that's a will that I was thinking about trying to incorporate into this presentation. It just became too much. But it's a very detailed description of a sword that was gifted to a religious institution in Manila at the end of the 16th century, and the description of the sword clarifies that it didn't actually have like a military use. It's a sword that's purely decorative. It has gemstones in the handle. It has silver and gold, and so I want to think about these kinds of objects within particular cultural experiences. But I'd like to find more information on spiritual contexts as well, and and I think Inquisition sources will be key to beginning that work. But yeah, so those are some questions that I still have. Yeah.
Thanks for your question, Dana. The two things that surprise me the most about the work that I do when I'm looking at the sort of the engagement between colonial systems and Philippine writing in both Spanish and Tagalog is the two things that always surprise me are the anger, the outrage, and also the humor. And I think that they're both there. When you look at For example, the production of metrical romances in Tagalog. You can see why the priests were so flustered with their subjects because they didn't understand the language enough to know all the euphemisms and the innuendos and these different things that people were communicating to each other. And they were having, they would go to the fiesta, they would perform these plays, everybody would be laughing, and the priest didn't know half of what was going on because if he had known it, he would have forbidden it. Sexual innuendos, criticisms of the priest, and authority, and you see that progression from the 18th century all the way to the 19th century with someone like Francisco Baltasar, who was a Tagalog poet in the 1840s and 50s, 30s, 40s, and 50s, and all of the anger and all of the humor is concentrated in this in the poetry. And so there's something about that always surprises me. Something about, you move forward a little bit and you look at the work of Jose Rizal and the anger that he expresses against the colonial system as not only acts of corruption, acts of abuse, but their sanction under a system, their approval under a system. And the anger explodes. Ambeth was talking yesterday about the Morga history that he annotated, and you look at some of those footnotes, and the anger just comes right out at you. I mean, it's almost as if you can see him, sitting down and shaking his fists as he's writing. So there's something about that always strikes me because it makes me realize that from the 16th century to the 19th century. Filipinos fought. And I don't want to get into the resistance versus resilience sort of thing, that collaboration that we were talking about earlier. But there is one, I think, unappreciated record of native Filipinos who were always fighting against the situation that they were given. They're always trying to do something about it. And I think that when you look at the literature, when you look at the origins of colonial theater, when you look at even the poetry of Gaspar Aquino de Belen's Mahal na Pasyon, which was a Tagalog passion that was written in 1704, the anger that comes in and through the sermons or the ara that he discusses is palpable, and it just kind of makes you, wow, that's crazy. Like that's all concentrated there. That's something that always really impresses me.
Thanks. Yeah, go ahead.
I'll just add one more surprising thing, like especially poring over the records of land ownership because that's my current project now. I was really surprised to see another ethnic group that owned land in the pueblos, and these were the South Asians. So I didn't expect them to be there at all. Well, they were called Malabares, and so that's my current project. And then I was also very surprised to see, well, Native women owning land and buying pawned land, meaning serving as money lenders to men. Um, Even the Chinese mestizas did the same. And then they did this across pueblos, no, across towns, and across genders and even ethnicity. So that was really surprising to me. And that's why I think archival research is really exciting. And yeah, I just keep my mind open to be surprised. Thanks.
Yeah, so I was just trying to tie this idea through the first two papers. How did the Spanish colonial government carry out their enforcement of the law on the natives through force, which this idea of power, and was the Spanish Inquisition active in the Philippines in the early modern period? Is there this police force that the military carried out their thing on the natives during that time? I'm curious about that.
So I can speak to the Inquisition part of this question. So the Inquisition in the Philippines was run basically as an extension of the New Spanish Inquisition, which was founded in 1571, um, and um, and so when For example, there were commissioners of the Inquisition that would cross the Pacific over the course of the colonial period and send denunciations back to Mexico City. And I think that what's really interesting about a lot of these denunciations is, and denunciations that occur over long distances more generally, is oftentimes, by the time the denunciations received, the conditions in the original place have changed, or perhaps the case is dropped in many ways, or witnesses can't be found. So what that means is local operations of the Inquisition end up having a bit more leeway to make more decisions, independent decisions. And when you do have cases of people who are actually prosecuted and punished in the Philippines, oftentimes they're deported to Mexico for incarceration or for punishment in one of the autos de fe in Mexico City. So it's a trans-Pacific Inquisition. Not nearly as many volumes survive as what we have for the Inquisition in Mexico, but there are still a few volumes that record denunciations, and then a few full-length cases as well. Yeah.
I'll just add that one of the paradoxes of the Inquisition is that it's a juridical process, right? That is undertaken by the official church. But again, the question of jurisdiction and justice in the Philippines is divided, and so the question, I guess, might be how do you undertake a juridical process in which there isn't a consensus on what justice is or what jurisdiction is. Having said that, there was an Inquisition in the Philippines, and it primarily addressed or was oriented towards the Spaniards, not the natives. And so you do have cases in the Mexican Archivo General de la Nación in the AGN in Mexico of various priests who were prosecuted by the Inquisition, various cases of brujeria or witchcraft that were being practiced either by the leading citizens of Manila, Spanish citizens of Manila, or other people. And every now and then you get these kind of weird crossovers where people are doing Inquisition-like work without it being the Inquisition. Hobie and Christine and I are working on a document from the late 17th century that's led by the Dominicans and has a very Inquisition-like procedure, although it itself is not classified as an inquisitorial proceeding. So, I think that, just in terms of what that means in terms of the enforcement of law, I think that of all the instruments of justice that people had in the Philippines, the juridical procedure was a long, costly, and oftentimes ineffective one. In addition to pastoral visits that I mentioned earlier, there were also official visits by members of the Royal Council to different provinces to sort of check things out and see what was going on. But these were procedures that could take sometimes years, and they involved a lot of paperwork. And sometimes the visits were effective in making certain reforms. Oftentimes they weren't.
This isn't something that I've studied specifically, but I do know that there are several Inquisition cases against people who are classified as conversos, specifically Portuguese, who are merchants kind of circulating throughout Southeast and East Asia, who end up in the Philippines and are denounced, and then in a couple of cases, again, deported to Mexico for persecution. And I guess just to clarify, one last thing about the Inquisition is, indigenous people were sort of formally classified as neophytes of the faith, and therefore exempted from persecution by the Inquisition. That being said, mestizos were persecuted. We have many examples of people who are called malabares, or people from Ternate, who are mestizos, who come under inquisitorial denunciation for divination or various kinds of things like that. And even outside of the Inquisition, as Jody said, like the language of inquisitorial denunciation or suspicion shows up in many other kinds of sources, and I'm working with one right now. In which there's a black family that of merchants who have dealings with people from Ternate and from Maluco and elsewhere, and some of the witnesses in a completely separate kind of case, it's a civil case, suspect that when these people come together under one roof, they must be practicing love magic or divination of some kind. So that kind of language or stereotypes perhaps are very widespread.
This refers to the visitation. There are many cases also in the 18th century which are not spoken about, but they are in the archives, when the archbishop was not available to do the visitation. He would transfer power to one of the religious orders. So among themselves also, the Dominican high official would examine the Cagayan province, where the Dominicans were also there. So what we see from presentations are a lot of rifts and stresses, but there are also lots of continuities which are not spoken about, but they are there in the archives. One last thing is that there's a difference between the monks and the friars. The monks are in the medieval era, and then the friars were those who came to the Philippines, because the monks had they were living in communities, closed communities, but the friars were a development after the monks. They were evangelizing outside. They lived in communities, but then they moved out to the outside the community. So technically, the missionaries who came to the Philippines were not monks, but they were friars.
Yeah, I use the word monks, rhetorically to emphasize the difference between the intraclausula and extraclausula, right? But to make things even more complicated, the religious orders would often conspire, let's say, to have a religious, a pope, or not pope, I'm sorry, an archbishop chosen who was from a religious order. And this is something that the Governor General Corsuera was complaining about in the early 17th century, is that in addition to the religious orders being outside the jurisdiction of the church, they would elect archbishops into the official church. So you can already kind of see the conflicts of interest that would ensue when there was a land dispute, when there was an issue about abuse or exploitation, and the archbishop who was dealing with the case was himself a member of the religious order in question. Thanks.
Okay, let's thank all our presenters.